What would happen if a simple farmer defeated the agribusiness elite in a million-dollar auction? John Miller entered the hall as an unknown and left with an empire. But behind his victory lies a secret that could change everything. Discover the truth behind this mystery. The golden ballroom of the Grand Magnificence Hotel was buzzing with the presence of the American agribusiness elite. Crystals clinked, conversations about millions floated in the air-conditioned atmosphere, and expensive perfumes mingled with the tension of anticipation. It was auction night, not just any auction, but the most prestigious event of the year, where only the most powerful dared to bid. Richard Thompson adjusted his Italian silk tie in front of the marble bathroom mirror. As president of Thompson Group, the largest grain processing conglomerate in the country, he was used to being the center of attention. His brown eyes, framed by worry lines, betrayed the anxiety he was trying to hide. Sunnybrook Farm, which would be auctioned off that night, was the missing piece to his empire. With its fertile lands and strategic location, it would be the crown jewel of his business. "No one will be able to compete with us today," said Albert Silver, his greatest ally and vice president of the group, entering the bathroom. "The others don't even know what's really at stake." Richard nodded, thinking about the plans he had for those lands. It wasn't just a farm, it was the key to his life's biggest project, an agro-industrial complex that would revolutionize the sector. But there was something that bothered him, a strange feeling he couldn't explain. Outside, the lobby was already full. Men in expensive suits and women in designer dresses circulated with champagne flutes, all part of the same exclusive circle. Richard knew every face there, or thought he did. That's when he saw him. A man wearing worn jeans and a faded cotton shirt crossed the main entrance. His worn boots made a different sound on the marble floor, clashing with the tinkle of Italian shoes. The security guard seemed confused, but the man showed a legitimate invitation and passed through. "Who's that?" asked Albert with a scornful smile. "Must be some curious onlooker," replied Richard, trying to disguise his own curiosity. "Maybe a small producer wanting to see how big business is done." The auction started promptly at 9 o'clock. The auctioneer, an elegant man with a powerful voice, began the presentation of Sunnybrook Farm. Richard barely listened. He knew every detail of that property by heart. His eyes occasionally turned to the simple man who remained quiet in a corner, observing everything with disconcerting attention. The bidding began. As expected, only the biggest market players participated. Richard and his group dominated, systematically raising the values. 2 hours passed, and the price had already reached stratospheric levels. Most participants had given up, leaving only the Thompson Group and 2 other competitors. $250 million, announced the auctioneer. Richard made his bid with a discreet nod. That's when it happened. The man in jeans calmly raised his hand. $300 million, he said, in a firm voice that echoed through the now silent hall. A murmur spread. Richard felt his blood freeze. Who was this man? How dare he interfere with his plans? $350 million, Richard countered, his voice betraying a note of irritation. The simple man just smiled. $400 million, he said, without changing his calm tone. The entire hall held its breath. Richard felt sweat running down his back, staining his Italian shirt. It wasn't just the money. It was his dream, his project, his vision of the future that was slipping through his fingers. $450 million, he shouted, losing his composure. The man in jeans looked directly into Richard's eyes for the first time. There was something in that look that made him shudder. $500 million, said the stranger with the same calmness of someone commenting on the weather. The hammer fell. The silence was deafening. Richard was paralyzed as he saw the simple man walk to the documentation table, pulling out a worn checkbook from his jeans pocket. John Miller, as he introduced himself when signing the papers, was a name no one there knew, but soon everyone would. That night marked not just the sale of a farm, it was the beginning of a story that would forever change American agribusiness. As the man left the hall, Richard couldn't take his eyes off him. He had the terrible feeling that their paths would cross again, and that this was just the first chapter of a much bigger story than anyone there could imagine. If this story interested you, Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. The news of the auction spread like wildfire in a sugarcane plantation. In less than 24 hours, all the major agribusiness newspapers were headlining the mysterious buyer of Sunnybrook Farm. Richard Thompson observed the reports in his office on the top floor of Thompson Building, in the financial heart of New York City, feeling the bitter taste of defeat. "Have we found out anything about him yet?" he asked Albert, who had just entered the room carrying a thick folder of documents. "What we've found is intriguing," replied Albert, adjusting his glasses. "John Miller has properties in 5 different states, all extremely productive. The curious thing is that he maintains a very low profile. No social events, no business associations. It's as if he existed only in official records." Richard swiveled in his Italian leather chair, contemplating the view of the city. Something didn't fit. How could someone build an empire of that size while remaining completely in the shadows? Meanwhile, 200 miles away, John Miller walked through the fields of his new property. The morning sun painted the crops golden, and the wind brought the smell of wet earth. His experienced eyes evaluated every detail: the quality of the soil, the irrigation system, the areas that needed attention. "Are you sure you want to do this personally, sir?" asked Jack, the farm's old foreman, curiously observing his new boss, who insisted on doing the inspection on foot under the strong sun. "I've always done it this way, Jack," John replied with a serene smile. "You don't really know a land without smelling it, without touching its soil with your own hands." What no one knew, not even Jack, was that those lands held a special meaning for John. Every step he took there unearthed memories from 40 years ago, when he was still a barefoot boy running between the plantations. At the farm headquarters, Mary, John's daughter, was organizing documents on her laptop. With a degree in agronomy and a master's in environmental management, she was the opposite of her father in appearance, always impeccably dressed, with designer clothes that contrasted with John's simple style. But they shared the same passion for the land and the same values. "Dad," she called when John returned from the inspection, "I just received an interesting proposal from the Thompson Group. They want to schedule a meeting." John smiled, a smile that Mary knew well. The same, one he gave when he saw a storm approaching on the horizon. "I was expecting this," he said, sitting in an old wooden chair on the porch. "Richard Thompson is not a man to accept defeats easily." The next day, at the Thompson Group headquarters, Richard was receiving an important call. "Mr. Thompson," said the voice on the other end of the line, "we've discovered something about Sunnybrook Farm's past that you need to know." Richard listened attentively, his eyes widening with each new piece of information. When he hung up the phone, a smile began to form on his lips. He was finally beginning to understand the puzzle that was John Miller. But John also had his own plans. That same afternoon, he gathered his closest team at the farm headquarters. Among maps, reports, and cups of strong coffee, he began to outline a vision he had been cultivating for decades. "Sunnybrook won't just be another productive farm," he explained, pointing to a digital map that Mary was projecting on the wall. "It will be a model of sustainable agriculture for the entire country. We're going to prove that it's possible to produce on a large scale while respecting the environment and people." Mary watched her father with admiration. Behind that simple man in worn clothes was one of the brightest minds in American agribusiness, but she also knew that the path wouldn't be easy. The project they were planning would challenge powerful, established interests. While the meeting was happening on the farm, Richard Thompson was convening his own council. In a meeting room overlooking the city, executives in suits and ties listened attentively to his new plan. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice loaded with determination, "we've discovered that Sunnybrook Farm has a very interesting history, a history that gives us certain advantages in negotiations." The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky red and gold. On the porch of Sunnybrook's headquarters, John contemplated the landscape with a cup of coffee in hand. His cell phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Mr. Miller," Richard Thompson's voice sounded strangely confident on the other end of the line, "I think we need to talk about the real reason you bought this farm." John closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of memories and the wind blowing from the fields. "Yes, Mr. Thompson," he replied with his characteristic calmness. "I think it's time for that conversation." In the city, Richard hung up the phone with a satisfied smile. He was sure he had found the key to bend that stubborn farmer. Little did he know that he was about to discover that some roots are much deeper than one can imagine, and that certain stories have enough power to change the destiny of generations. The next day promised to be a watershed in the history of American agribusiness. But as every good farmer knows, some seeds need time to germinate, and the sweetest fruits are those that ripen naturally. The morning dawned loaded with expectation at Sunnybrook Farm. The scene had been carefully prepared, a white tent erected near the experimental fields, chairs organized in a semicircle, media equipment strategically positioned. Journalists from the agricultural sector, environmentalists, researchers, and important businessmen were beginning to arrive, curious about the reason for the mysterious summons. Richard Thompson adjusted his tie as his driver parked the BMW at the farm's entrance. Beside him, Albert held a black folder containing what they believed to be their trump card. "Are you sure you want to do this here now?" asked Albert, concerned about the amount of media present. "What better time to expose the truth?" replied Richard with a confident smile. "Let's see how our mysterious farmer deals with a little public pressure." Inside the farm headquarters, Mary was assisting John with the final preparations. Her father was wearing, for the first time she could remember, a suit, simple but elegant. In his hands, a notebook with a worn leather cover. "Have the special." "Guests arrived?" he asked, adjusting his tie with some difficulty. "Yes, Dad, Mrs. Clements is in the library with Clara Montgomery, and the researchers from the Department of Agriculture have just arrived too." John nodded, his eyes fixed on an old photograph on the wall, the same one he had received in the mysterious envelope days before. "The time has come to honor the promise I made to your grandfather," he said, his voice laden with contained emotion. In the improvised research center near the tent, a team of scientists was carefully examining soil and plant samples. The results of the preliminary analyses were surprising, confirming something that seemed impossible. Sunnybrook's soil presented fertility and biodiversity levels well above normal, even after decades of intensive cultivation. Richard circulated among the guests, greeting acquaintances and exchanging calculated smiles. His eyes, however, didn't leave the entrance of the farm headquarters, waiting for the moment when John would appear. The crowd's buzz diminished when Mary took the improvised stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your presence on this historic morning. Before we officially begin, I'd like to introduce some special guests." To everyone's surprise, the first person introduced was Mrs. Clements, who entered supported by Clara Montgomery's arm. The lady, despite her advanced age, maintained an elegant bearing and a lively, attentive look. Richard felt a chill down his spine as he recognized the old housekeeper. How had she gotten there? His investigators hadn't been able to locate her anywhere. "And now," Mary continued, "I'd like to call my father, John Miller, to share with you something that has been kept for 40 years. John took the stage under curious glances and some whispers. Beside him, a large screen began to display old images of the farm, documents, and graphs. "Many of you must be wondering why an apparently simple man like me invested a fortune to buy this specific farm," he began, his calm voice carrying the weight of experience. "The answer begins 4 decades ago, when 2 visionary men developed a revolutionary cultivation method here." Richard stepped forward, holding his black folder tightly. It was his chance to interrupt this theater. "Interesting you mention that, Miller," he said loudly, walking towards the stage, "because I have documents here that prove your father abandoned Frank Montgomery and disappeared with valuable information from the farm." A murmur ran through the audience. John, however, maintained his characteristic calm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he continued, "allow me to present something that Richard Thompson couldn't find in his investigation." With a gesture, he called Mrs. Clements to the stage. The elderly lady carried an old wooden box. "I kept this for 40 years, she said, her voice choked, "following Frank Montgomery's own instructions." Clara Montgomery joined them, carrying her grandfather's diaries. "My grandfather never lost hope that one day the truth would be revealed," she said, handing the documents to John. What followed was a revelation that left the audience in absolute silence. Projected on the screen, documents, photos, and letters told a very different story from what Richard had imagined. John's father hadn't abandoned the farm. He had been forced to step away to protect the discovery that he and Frank had made. The method they developed, explained John, as images of modern analyses appeared on the screen, wasn't just about productivity. It was about harmony with nature, about understanding that soil is a living organism that needs to be nourished, not exploited. The Department of Agriculture researchers stood up, confirming with scientific data what John was saying. The method developed 40 years ago was decades ahead of its time, anticipating regenerative agriculture practices that were only now beginning to be valued globally. Richard remained paralyzed, seeing his plan crumble. The folder in his hands, which he thought contained ammunition against John, now seemed insignificant in the face of the true story being revealed. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. John paused, looked at Mary, who nodded encouragingly, and then continued, "And today we're not just here to reveal the past, we're here to announce the future." On the screen appeared the project that Mary had prepared, an ambitious plan that would transform Sunnybrook into a research and development center for sustainable agriculture, open to producers of all sizes. "Because the true wealth of the land," John concluded, "isn't in what we can take from it, but in what we can learn from it." The sun was high in the sky when the presentation ended. Richard Thompson left the farm in silence, while journalists crowded around John, Mary, Clara, and Mrs. Clements. A new era was beginning in American agribusiness, and it had roots much deeper than anyone could have imagined. 6 months passed since the revelation at Sunnybrook Farm. The afternoon sun painted the new experimental fields golden, where dozens of small producers participated in a workshop on sustainable cultivation techniques. Mary observed the scene from the headquarters porch, her laptop open showing the latest soil analyses. "Your grandfather would be proud," said Mrs. Clements, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. At 82 years old, she had decided to remain on the farm, now occupying a special role as the guardian of the place's memory. "Dad said the same thing this morning," replied Mary, accepting the coffee, before leaving for the meeting in Washington, D.C. John was in the federal capital, presenting the preliminary results of the project to a committee of the Department of Agriculture. The method developed by his father and Frank Montgomery, now perfected with modern technology, was proving to be even more revolutionary than they had imagined. In the Thompson Group office in New York City, Richard observed the city through other glass windows. The last few months had been an exercise in humility. After the revelation at Sunnybrook, his stocks had plummeted, and several investors were questioning his leadership. "Sir," his secretary interrupted, "Clara Montgomery is here for the scheduled meeting." Richard adjusted his tie, surprised. He didn't expect her to actually come. Clara entered the room with firm steps, carrying a folder and a serene countenance that very much resembled her grandfather. "Thank you for receiving me, Richard," she said, sitting down. "I believe it's time for a frank conversation about the future." At Sunnybrook, Jack, the foreman, was guiding a group of university students through the fields. "Look at this area here," he explained, pointing to a particularly green stretch. "Using the Montgomery-Miller method, we managed to recover soil that was practically desertified in just 6 months. The students took notes enthusiastically. Among them was Peter Thompson, Richard's youngest son, who had enrolled in the farm's internship program without revealing his true last name. His notes were the most detailed, his eyes shining with each new discovery. In Washington, D.C., John was finishing his presentation to a packed room. "What we propose is not just a cultivation method," he explained, his calm voice carrying the weight of experience. "It's a new way of thinking about our relationship with the land." The numbers spoke for themselves. Productivity 40% higher than the national average, water consumption reduced by 60%, complete soil regeneration in areas previously considered lost. Even more impressive was the social impact. Small producers who adopted the method were achieving results that once seemed impossible. Back in New York, the meeting between Richard and Claire was ongoing. "What you're proposing is..." Richard paused, searching for the right words. "Ambitious." "It's the next logical step," Claire replied. "The Mendoza Group has the structure and influence. Santa Clara Farm has the knowledge and credibility. Together we could transform American agribusiness." At the farm, Mary received an important call. It was Leo Sanders, one of the world's leading experts in regenerative agriculture. "The results are undeniable," he said excitedly. "You've managed to prove that it's possible to do large-scale agriculture in a truly sustainable way." As evening fell, John returned to Santa Clara Farm. His modest car passed by the new research center, where lights still on showed researchers working. He smiled at the sight of the native seedling nursery, Mary's personal project, already with more than 10,000 catalogued species. At the main house, a surprise awaited him. Richard Mendoza was there, accompanied by Claire and Peter, his youngest son. "Good evening, John," said Richard, his voice different from the last time they met. "I think we need to talk about the future." The following hours were filled with frank and deep conversation. Richard admitted his mistakes, shared the lessons learned in recent months. Peter revealed his identity and his desire to join the Santa Clara Farm project. Claire presented her partnership proposal. John listened to everything with his characteristic silent attention. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same serenity as always. "The land has its own way of teaching humility. To all of us. Perhaps it's time we learn this lesson together." A year later, Santa Clara Farm had transformed into the largest sustainable agriculture research center in North America. The Montero Ferreira method, now patented and available free of charge to small producers, was revolutionizing the sector. Mary coordinated an international team of researchers, while Peter Mendoza led the training program for young farmers. Richard and John, unlikely partners, traveled across the country sharing their vision of a more sustainable and inclusive agribusiness. On a quiet afternoon, John walked through the fields with his 5-year-old granddaughter Emily. The little girl stooped to grab a handful of soil, letting it run through her fingers. "Grandpa," she asked, "why is the land so important?" John smiled, remembering his father making the same gesture decades ago. "Because it holds our stories, little one, and when we take good care of it, it teaches us the most important thing, that we're all connected, that true success isn't in owning the land, but in learning from it." The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with colors that seemed to celebrate the triumph of life over greed, of wisdom over power, of respect over exploitation. At Santa Clara Farm, the lights of the research center began to turn on, as a new generation of farmers learned the ancient and ever-new art of cultivating the land with love and respect. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Santa Clara Farm has touched your hearts and shown that true success goes beyond money and power. To continue this journey of inspiring stories from American agribusiness, we've prepared a special playlist that you can find by clicking on the link to the left. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like. Every day we bring unique narratives that explore the richness and diversity of our country. Tell us in the comments, what moment touched your heart the most? We're eager to read your impressions and continue sharing stories that make a difference. Until next time.